January 15th, 1888, Turner County, Dakota Territory. The rescue party had already found 3 bodies that morning. The first was a man Norwegian frozen in his barn with his hands still wrapped around the handle of a feed bucket. The second and third were a mother and her infant son found together in the ruins of what had been their kitchen, the iron stove beside them cold as iron gets when no one has fed it in 2 days. The men on horseback did not speak much between stops. There was nothing useful to say. They rode with the particular silence of people doing a job that has to be done regardless of what they find at the end of it. The Brenner homestead was the last name on their list. A German-Russian widow, 63 years old, 3 grandchildren under 10, a sick daughter-in-law, a tar paper shanty 15 miles from the nearest settlement, no husband, no sons, no neighbors within reasonable distance, no smoke rising from the chimney. The men looked at each other and did not need to speak. No smoke meant what no smoke always meant. The blizzard had lasted 3 days. The temperature had not risen above -27. They had seen what -27 did to families with iron stoves and 12 cords of wood. They had seen it up close twice already before noon. They dug through the 6-foot drift blocking the door. The drift was hard and crusted on the surface, and soft underneath the way Dakota drifts get when wind is packed at the top and the weight of it has compressed what lies below. It took 4 men with shovels 15 minutes to reach the door. They worked without speaking. One of them, a man named Erickson, who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite in the blizzard of '83, kept his face turned slightly away from what he expected to find when they opened it. They pushed the door open. Warm air hit their frostbitten voices like a summer afternoon. Not the residual warmth of a room that had recently been heated and was losing it. Not the brief fading heat of coals burning down. This was real warmth, the warmth of a room that was currently actively, fundamentally warm. The kind of warmth that comes from a source that has not faltered and is not planning to. Inside, 2 children were playing on the floor. A girl of about 9 was reading aloud from a German Bible to a boy of about 6, who was pretending to listen while constructing something from a collection of small stones. An infant was sleeping in a wooden cradle near the center of the room, her face round and calm and the color of health. A young woman lay in a bed against the far wall, propped on pillows, eating from a bowl in her lap. And in the center of the room stood a structure unlike anything the rescue party had ever seen inside a Dakota homestead. It was massive. 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, 5 feet tall, rising from the dirt floor like something that belonged to a different century. It was made of clay, whitewashed to a pale cream, its surface smooth and slightly curved at the corners. No fire burned in it, no flame was visible. But the heat it radiated was as steady and constant as the heat from a summer stone wall. In the afternoon, the deep, patient warmth of something that has been holding heat for a very long time and intends to go on holding it. Erickson walked to it. He took off his glove and pressed his palm against the clay surface. He held it there for a long moment. Then he knelt and pressed his palm against the floor near the base of the stove. The floor was warm enough to sit on. He looked up. In the doorway of the small lean-to kitchen stood a woman of 63 years. Her hair was white and pinned back. Her hands were rough and large-knuckled, the hands of someone who had been doing heavy work since before most of the men in the rescue party were born. She was holding a loaf of dark bread that she had apparently just taken from the oven. She looked at the men in her doorway without particular surprise. She had been expecting someone would come eventually. Erickson said one word. "How?" The old woman looked at him. Then she set the bread down on the table, came to the stove, and placed her palm flat against its clay surface. She said, "My mother taught me. To understand what Marta Brenner built and why it held when everything else failed, you have to go back 4 months to September of 1887 to a wagon moving through the flat brown grass of Turner County with a woman of 63 on the seat and 3 children behind her, and everything she owned in the world packed into the space between them. Her son Wilhelm had died on a Tuesday. A horse had stumbled in the creek crossing 3 miles east of the homestead. The horse had recovered. Wilhelm had not. He was 31 years old, and he had come to Dakota Territory from the German-Russian community in Freeman because the land was available and the soil was deep, and a man with strong hands and a willing back could make something from it if he was willing to work. He had been willing. He had filed his claim, built his shanty, broken his first acres, and married a woman named Hilda, who had given him 3 children in 6 years. Then the horse stumbled, and the work was over, and the children still needed feeding, and Hilda was in bed with a fever that had not broken in 3 weeks following the birth of the youngest, and the winter was coming. Marta had sold what she could from her house in Freeman. Her furniture, her husband's tools, the good dishes her mother had brought from Ukraine. What she kept was what she needed: a cast iron pot, her sewing kit, a Bible, and the knowledge her mother had given her 47 years earlier in a village in the Molochna colony, the knowledge that had sat in her memory unused for decades and had surfaced now like something she had always known was there waiting. She drove the wagon into the homestead on a Thursday afternoon with $31 in her skirt pocket and the particular determination of a woman who has already calculated the situation and arrived at the only conclusion that makes any sense. Nate Halverson rode over the following morning. He was a big man, wide through the chest and shoulders, with a face that 48 years in 10 Dakota winters had worked into something weathered and direct. He had the homestead 3/4 of a mile to the northwest, and he had been watching the Brenner claim since Wilhelm died, and he had come over because he was the kind of man who did not watch a difficult situation from a distance when he could do something about it. He took in the shanty, the tar paper walls through which daylight showed in several places, the rusted cook stove with the cracked firebox that the previous owner had left behind as not worth hauling away, the 3 children watching him from the doorway, the absence of a woodpile. He said, "Ma'am, I don't know what your plan is, but I need to tell you something. I've been on this prairie for 10 years. I buried my daughter in the winter of '81. She was 7. The cold came through the walls, and there wasn't enough wood, and she went to sleep and didn't wake up." He paused. He said, "I'm telling you this because I don't want to bury your grandchildren. The best thing you can do for those children is sell this claim before November and take them back to Freeman. Find a place with people around you. This prairie kills people who aren't ready." Marta listened to all of this. Then she said, "I thank you, Mr. Halverson. Now I need to work." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he tipped his hat and turned his horse. At the edge of her property, he looked back. He called, "I hope you listen. I truly do." She didn't answer. She was already walking toward the creek bank with the rusted wagon and a spade. That night, after the children slept, Marta sat at the table with the tallow candle and counted her money. $31, 3 children. An infant who needed warmth to survive, a daughter-in-law who could not get out of bed, no husband, no sons, no English, no wood within 40 miles that didn't cost more than she had. She had done the arithmetic before she left Freeman. She had done it again on the wagon. She did it now a third time, not because the numbers had changed, but because she wanted to be certain she had not missed anything. 8 cords of wood. The minimum Halverson had told her. 8 cords at $4 a cord delivered. $32. She had 31. A proper iron stove. The cracked one in the corner would not hold heat. A new cast iron stove from the hardware in Huron. $18 to $20. $50 minimum. She had 31. Coal. $12 to $15 a ton delivered by rail. 4 to 6 tons needed. $48 to $90. She had $31. Every conventional path to survival cost more than she possessed. Every calculation ended in the same place. But there was another path. It was not a path that anyone in Turner County would recognize. It was not a path that the hardware store in Huron could sell her or that Halverson, with his 10 years of Dakota experience, would think to suggest. It was a path that existed in her memory, specifically in the memory of a summer afternoon in 1840 when she was 16 years old, and her mother had put her hands into a mixture of clay and manure and straw and said, "This is how we stay warm." Her mother's stove was still standing. She had helped build it. It had stood for 47 years through winters that would have broken anything made of iron. Marta looked at her hands in the candlelight. They were strong from farm labor. They were rough from decades of work. They would have to be enough. She blew out the candle and went to bed. In the morning, she would begin. She started with the clay. The creek bank a quarter mile from the shanty held the kind of red-brown clay that her hands recognized the moment she pressed them into it. Heavy plastic, the right amount of moisture, the kind that held its shape when you formed it and dried without cracking if you mixed it correctly. She loaded it into the wagon by hand, 1 shovelful at a time, and hauled it back across the stubble field. 8 loads the first day, 10 the second. Her shoulders screamed after the third day and she ignored them. The mixing came next. Halverson had given her manure from his barn, glad to be rid of it. Prairie grass she cut with a borrowed scythe. The proportions her hands remembered better than her mind. 2 parts clay, 1 part manure, half a part straw. The mixture had to hold its shape when squeezed and cracked cleanly when dried. She built the forms from scrap lumber. 4 inches by 8 inches by 12 inches, the same dimensions her mother had used. She pressed the mixture in, packed it tight, turned them out onto boards to dry in the autumn sun. 50 bricks the first day. Her target was 800. Greta helped when she came home from the work Marta assigned her. The girl was 9 and serious with her father's eyes and her mother's capacity for sustained attention. She mixed clay with her small arms, churning through the heavy paste, her face set with the concentration of someone doing something that matters. Rupert carried water from the creek, 6 years old, and already understanding that the carrying was necessary, even if he didn't fully understand why. Marta showed Greta the proportions. The way to test whether the mixture was right: squeeze a handful, open your palm, look at how it holds. She showed her how to pack the forms, how to release them without disturbing the edges, how to set them on the boards so the air could reach every face. She explained what she was building. She said the fire does not heat the house. The clay heats the house. The fire only puts heat into the clay. Greta thought about this. She said, like a battery. Marta did not know the word. She had lived in America for 11 years, and her English was functional for trade and limited for everything else. She said, I don't know that word. Greta said at school they told us. A battery stores energy. You put energy in and it comes out later. Marta looked at her granddaughter for a moment. She said yes, exactly like that. On the 23rd of October, a shadow fell across the doorway. Marta was on her knees in the center of the shanty, laying the 4th course of bricks around the firebox opening, when she looked up and saw narrow-faced spectacles and the expression of a man who has already decided what he is looking at. His name was Dawson. He was a land inspector for the General Land Office, and he had the manner of someone who does this work because it gives him authority he would not otherwise have, and who has learned to confuse that authority with knowledge. He moved through the shanty the way such men move through spaces they consider beneath them, quickly cataloging, not seeing what is there, but confirming what he expected to find. His eyes moved from the tar paper walls to the dirt floor, to the rusted cook stove in the corner, to the half-built clay structure rising in the center of the room. He said no wood stockpile. He said no coal. He said no proper heating apparatus. He gestured at the stove. He said, what is this? Marta stood up. She had clay dust on her hands and her apron and her knees. She said, a stove. Russian design. Dawson stared at it the way people stare at things they have classified as wrong before they fully understand them. He said, Mrs. Brenner, the Homestead Act requires you to make improvements to your claim. What I see here is a tar paper shanty with a dirt floor and a mud oven. This is not an improvement. Marta's English had limits. She wanted to explain about thermal mass, about the channels inside the structure that routed hot gas through 20 feet of clay before letting it escape, about the physical principles that made this design superior to any iron stove ever manufactured. What she could say with her vocabulary and her grammar was not equal to what she knew. She said this stove, big, hold heat, long time. Dawson smiled in the way of a man who has heard every excuse. He wrote in his notebook. He closed the notebook. He looked at her and at the 3 children watching from the corner and at the shape of Hilda in the bed against the far wall. He said, if you and those children are not here in spring, I'll know I was right. He left without saying goodbye. Marta stood in the doorway and watched him ride away. Her hands were at her sides. Her face showed nothing. She stood there until he was small against the grass, and then smaller, and then gone. Then she turned and went back to her bricks. The setback came in the last week of October. She woke to rain, hard driving rain that had moved in before dawn and was already pulling against the base of the shanty walls when she pulled on her shawl and stepped outside to check the drying bricks. 40 of them had softened overnight. Their edges had crumbled. Their surfaces were pocked and starting to dissolve. 3 days of work was sitting in the mud, dissolving in front of her eyes. She stood in the rain and looked at them. She did not cry. She was 63 years old, and she had buried a husband and watched a son die and crossed an ocean in a ship that smelled of illness. And she had been doing difficult things for so long that the initial impact of a difficult thing registered differently than it did for people who had not yet learned the difference between a thing that is painful and a thing that is fatal. This was painful. She did the arithmetic. 3 days to remake the lost bricks. 3 days she did not have, not cleanly, not without cost somewhere else. Rupert's cough had deepened that week into something wet and persistent that she monitored with the careful attention of a woman who understood what wet coughs became when they were not addressed. 2 days of brick-making had already been lost to sitting with him at night heating water on the cracked stove to make steam he could breathe through. She stood in the rain a moment longer. Then she went inside and woke Greta. They began remaking the bricks before breakfast. November brought the first real cold, and with it the problem she had been dreading. The stove was nearly complete. The firebox was fully formed, lined with the hardest fired bricks she had managed to produce. The internal channels were in place, routed through the body of the structure in the pattern her mother had taught her, designed to extract heat from the exhaust gases before allowing them to escape through the chimney, maximizing what the clay absorbed with every firing. What was not in place was the damper. She had built the opening for it according to her memory of her mother's stove, and her memory had been slightly wrong. The opening was a quarter-inch too narrow on one side. The iron plate she had traded her grandmother's feather bed to acquire carried across the Atlantic in a canvas sack. The most valuable thing Hilda owned, traded at the hardware in Freeman, for the iron door and damper assembly, would not close flush against its seat. Smoke would leak. Heat would escape. The most critical junction in the entire system was a quarter-inch short of correct. She found a broken knife in the bottom of a crate of odds and ends she had brought from Freeman. The blade was intact, but the handle had split. She wrapped rags around the broken end to protect her hand and began scraping clay from the opening, a thin paring at a time, testing the damper against its seat, scraping more, testing again. She worked for 9 hours. Her fingernails split before the 4th hour. By the 6th hour, the rags protecting her hand were soaked through, and she replaced them with a piece cut from her second apron, the better one, the one she had not used since the crossing. By the 9th hour, she could feel the pulse in her thumb, but not the thumb itself, which she identified as a condition to be noted and ignored. The damper seated flush at the end of the 9th hour. She tested it 3 times to be certain. It held each time. She set the knife down and sat on the floor of the shanty and pressed her damaged hand against the unfinished clay surface of the stove. Outside, the November wind pressed against the tar paper walls, finding the gaps she had not yet sealed, curling cold fingers through the spaces between the logs at the corners. The temperature inside the shanty had dropped to 18 degrees. Ice had formed in the water bucket. The children were asleep under every blanket she owned, 3 small bodies pressed together for warmth. The stove was not yet ready to fire. It needed 2 weeks to cure. The clay was still damp in its deeper layers. If she fired it now, the heat would expand the moisture unevenly. Cracks would form. The structure she had spent 6 weeks building would fail. She would have to wait. She sat on the floor of the shanty with her damaged hand against the clay and let herself have the question she had not allowed herself before, the question she had kept at a distance through every load of clay and every hour of mixing and every brick and every course laid and every seam plastered smooth. What if her mother had remembered it wrong? What if the proportions were slightly off, or the channels were routed incorrectly, or the clay from the Turner County Creek bank behaved differently from the clay of the Malachina colony, or the curing time in a Dakota? November was different from the curing time in a Ukrainian summer. What if she had spent 6 weeks building the wrong thing? She sat with that question for a long moment. Then she stood up, checked on Greta and Rupert and the sleeping infant, and went to bed. In the morning, she would begin the curing fires, small ones, just enough warmth to start the process without stressing the clay. She would nurse it along the way she had nursed Rupert through his worst nights, carefully, incrementally, not asking more of it than it could give at each stage. It would be ready when it was ready. And when it was ready, the winter would find out what 63 years of knowing was worth. The first curing fire burned on a Tuesday evening in early November. Marta packed 40 pounds of twisted prairie grass into the firebox. Not the full load, a quarter of what a proper firing would require, just enough heat to begin warming the clay without demanding more from it than damp clay could safely give. She lit the match and stepped back. The grass caught immediately. Prairie grass always did. It burned hot and fast, the way everything dry and fibrous burns when it has been cut and twisted and dried in the autumn wind. And within 2 minutes, the firebox was roaring with a fire that seemed from the outside disproportionate to the small amount of material she had put into it. Hilda raised herself on one elbow from the bed and watched. Greta sat cross-legged on the floor with her chin in her hands, watching the way a child watches something she has been told matters. Rupert stood beside the stove with one hand 6 inches from its surface, not touching, testing the air. Baby Lotta slept. The fire burned for 18 minutes. And then it died back to coals, and the coals faded, and there was no more visible fire. Hilda said from the bed, "Is that it?" Marta said nothing. She put her palm flat against the clay surface, held it there. Warmth, not the immediate surface. Warmth of clay that has been near a fire, but something deeper, something that was moving outward from inside the structure, as if the clay had absorbed the heat and was now releasing it the way the earth releases the warmth of a summer day after the sun has gone down. She moved her hand to a different section of the surface. Same thing, and to another, and to the back wall furthest from the firebox. Slightly cooler there, but warming. The temperature inside the shanty climbed from 38 degrees to 44 degrees in the first hour after the fire went out. She built another small fire at midnight, then one at 4 in the morning. By the following evening, 2 days into the curing process, the interior temperature with no active fire burning was holding at 42 degrees. Outside, the November wind was pushing the temperature to 11 above zero. The gap between outside and inside was 31 degrees, and she had not burned a single full firing yet. She kept the notebook she had bought in Freeman, a small composition book with a brown cover, and she recorded the readings. Morning temperature outside, morning temperature inside, evening temperature outside, evening temperature inside, the number of pounds of grass burned each day. She recorded these things with the same methodical care she had applied to every step of the construction, because she understood that what she was doing was not just survival, it was evidence, and evidence needed to be precise. The curing took 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, the Dakota November settled in with the particular serious cold of a season that knows it has months of work ahead and is not in a hurry about any of it. The temperature outside the shanty dropped to 15 below on the coldest night of November, and Marta woke at 3 in the morning when she heard Rupert coughing in the corner and built a full curing fire and sat beside the stove with her hand against its surface and felt the clay working, felt the heat moving outward through 12 inches of packed earth and straw and manure into the space where her grandchildren were sleeping. Rupert's cough was a problem, and she watched carefully. He had been coughing since Lincoln, Nebraska 2 autumns ago, where his father had died and the dust of the plains had settled into the lungs of everyone who had traveled through it. The cough came and went with the weather worse in cold and better in warmth, and the steady ambient heat of the curing stove seemed to ease it. On the warmest nights in November nights, when the clay had been firing for 3 days straight and the interior temperature was holding in the middle 40s, the cough was almost absent. On the coldest nights when the curing fires were smallest and the temperature dropped, it came back. She noted this in her composition book alongside the temperature readings, not because she needed the evidence for herself, because she understood that one day someone would ask, and the answer needed to be recorded somewhere she could point to. On the 14th of November, she built the first full fire. 40 pounds of twisted grass packed into the firebox, the damper set the match struck. The grass caught in the way it always caught, fast and hot, and the fire roared up through the firebox and into the first channel, and she could hear the sound of it, the particular rushing, whistling sound of hot gas moving through a confined passage, the sound her mother's stove had made on winter mornings in the colony when she was a girl. The fire burned for 22 minutes. Then the grass was ash and the fire was out, and the stove sat there in the center of the room, whitewashed and massive and silent. Hilda was watching from the bed. She had been watching every stage of this process with the expression of a woman who wants very much to believe something and is afraid of what happens if she allows herself to believe it and is proven wrong. She said, and now Marta placed her palm against the clay. Hot. Not painfully so, but genuinely hot, the way a stone gets hot after a full summer day. A deep heat that went all the way through rather than sitting on the surface. She moved her hand to the top of the stove. Hot there too, the seas, the back. Every surface she touched was radiating heat with an evenness she had forgotten since childhood. The even, patient heat of thermal mass that has absorbed as much as it can hold and is ready to give it back. She looked at the thermometer she had nailed to the wall near the door. Inside, temperature 41 degrees when she lit the fire. Inside temperature, now 20 minutes after the fire went out, 41 degrees. The fire had been burning for 22 minutes and the room temperature hadn't changed because the room wasn't being heated by the fire directly. The room was being heated by the stove. She waited. 1 hour after the fire, the thermometer read 48 degrees. 2 hours, 53. 3 hours with no fire burning, no fuel being consumed, nothing but clay, releasing what it had stored, 55 degrees. Greta had been watching the thermometer with her arms crossed and her chin tilted up in the posture she used when she was trying to appear older than 9. She said, "Boy." Then she caught herself. She had been slipping between German and the English she learned at school since they arrived, and occasionally a phrase of the Ukrainian her grandmother spoke would surface from somewhere. She corrected herself. She said, "Grandma, it's working." Marta did not answer. She was looking at the thermometer. She said yes. Then in a quieter voice, to no one in particular, to the stove or to the memory of the woman who had taught her to build it, "Yes, I know." Nate Halverson came in the second week of December. The temperature that day was 15 below zero. He rode over with his coat collar up and his hat pulled down, and his horse moving with the careful, stiff-legged gait of an animal that knows the cold and respects it. He tied the horse at the post Marta had driven into the ground near the door and knocked. She let him in. He stepped into the shanty and stopped. He stood just inside the doorway for a moment and did not move. He was a man who had spent 10 years reading the temperature of a room when he entered it, who had developed that skill from necessity, the way people on the Dakota Prairie developed all their skills because the information was not optional. He felt what the room was, and he stood still. He said, "How warm is it in here?" She said, 53. "When I fired 2 hours ago, it will reach 55 by evening." He said, 53. "It's 15 below outside." She said, "Yes." He walked to the stove. He pulled his glove off and pressed his hand against the clay surface the way Erickson would press his hand against it 5 weeks later, and held it there and said nothing for a long moment. He said, "I'll be damned." He walked a slow circle around the stove. He looked at the firebox opening at the channels visible inside it, at the way the smoke passage rose and turned and rose again before reaching the chimney pipe. He was a practical man who understood construction, and he could read the design in the structure even without being told how it worked. He studied it the way a man studies a thing he did not believe was possible and is revising that belief in real time. He said, "What did you burn?" She said, 40 pounds of grass. Prairie grass twisted. The same as I use every time. He said, 40 pounds of grass gave you this. She said, "The grass puts heat into the clay. The clay holds it. When the grass is gone, the clay keeps giving." He stood looking at the stove. He said, "You haven't seen a real Dakota blizzard yet. This is early winter. 15 below is nothing. Wait until it drops to 30, 40. Wait until the wind comes and you can't see your hand in front of your face for 3 days." She said, "Then I will wait." He looked at her. He looked at Greta and Rupert, who were sitting on the warm floor near the stove doing their lessons, at Hilda sitting up in bed eating from a bowl for the first time in 3 days, at the sleeping infant in her cradle. He said, "I hope you're right. I truly do." He said goodbye and walked out into the 15 below afternoon and rode back to his homestead. Marta watched him go through the small grease paper window. She had seen the thing that moved across his face when he stood at the stove. She had seen it cross the faces of people all her life, the specific expression of someone encountering something they have been told is impossible and discovering that the telling was wrong. She had first seen it on the face of a neighbor in the Molochna colony who had come to inspect her mother's stove in the winter of 1843 and left without saying much, and returned in the spring to ask if he could build one. It was the expression of a man beginning to revise his understanding of what was possible. She turned away from the window. She had work to do. The morning of January 12th was wrong from the moment it started. The temperature had risen overnight. Not dramatically, it never rose dramatically in January on the Dakota Prairie, but enough that when Marta opened the shanty door at 5 in the morning to check the outside thermometer, the air that met her face was 10 degrees warmer than it had been the previous evening. Warm air in January on the Dakota Prairie was not a gift. She had heard enough from the old-timers in Freeman to know what warm air in January sometimes preceded. How a cold front building over Alberta could stay invisible for days, moving southeast across empty country until it hit the warm air over the plains, and the collision produced something that killed people. But it was 5 in the morning, and the air was mild, and the sky was still dark, and she could not see the horizon, and there was work to do, and the children had been kept inside for 2 weeks and needed sun and space. She let them out after breakfast. Greta went first, pulling on her coat with the eagerness of a child who has been indoors too long. Rupert followed, his cough lighter than it had been in weeks after the consistent warmth of the stove. Hilda, who had been improving steadily for 10 days, wrapped Lotta in every blanket available and carried her to the doorway to feel the sun. And then, because the air was genuinely mild and the baby was bundled, and it was the first day in weeks she had felt strong enough, she stepped outside. Marta was at the table mending a tear in Rupert's coat. She looked up at 11 o'clock when the light through the greased paper window changed. She could not have said exactly what changed about it. The quality of it, perhaps. The way light has a particular quality when the sky behind it is doing something unusual. She stood up and went to the door and opened it. The western horizon was white, not cloudy white, not the ordinary gray white of an overcast winter sky. This was a different white, a churning, boiling white that rose from the edge of the land to the height of the sky and was moving fast, moving the way a wall moves when something large is pushing it. The wind shifted. She felt it as a physical thing, a violent pivot from the south to the northwest, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took her to register what she was seeing. She did not walk to the children. She ran. She had not run in years. Her knees registered their objection, and she ignored them. She covered the distance from the door to where Greta and Rupert were standing in the snow, and grabbed Rupert's hand and Greta's arm and turned them toward the shanty. The snow began before they were halfway back, not falling, driving. Horizontal, dense and immediate, the kind of snow that moves like a solid wall, rather than individual flakes that fills your eyes and your nose in the space between your coat and your collar before you have taken a second breath. Greta shouted something. The wind took the sound and destroyed it. Rupert was moving. She could feel his hand. She pulled him forward, and then she heard Hilda's voice from somewhere in the white nothing, high and cracking, with a terror that needed no translation. Maria, Lotte, where is the baby? The wind had taken Hilda's grip on the blankets. Lotte was in the snow somewhere in the white, somewhere between the shanty and where Hilda had been standing, and the temperature was dropping by the minute, and the drift was already building, and the visibility was already gone. Marta had prepared for this. She did not know she had prepared for it. She had not thought it through as a plan or a precaution or a thing she was doing intentionally. But when she had moved into the shanty in September, in those first practical days of assessing what the place had and did not have and what needed to be done, she had nailed a wooden peg beside the door and hung a coil of rope from it. She had done this because her mother had done this, because in a climate where visibility could disappear in minutes, a rope from the door to the well, or the barn, or the outhouse was not a precaution. It was infrastructure. She shoved Greta toward the door. She said, "Get inside, hold your brother. Don't let go of the door. Don't come out." She tied one end of the rope around the door handle. She tied the other end around her own waist. Then she walked into the white. There is a particular quality to being inside a blizzard that people who have not experienced it do not fully understand from descriptions. It is not dark. The snow itself provides a kind of light, a diffuse, sourceless white that seems to come from every direction simultaneously and illuminates nothing. You can see the snow. You can see nothing else. The ground disappears. The sky disappears. The distinction between up and down becomes something you maintain by feel and by the pressure of the wind rather than by sight. Marta walked. The wind pushed against her left side with the force she leaned into a constant pressure that she used as a compass. The rope played out behind her. She counted her steps. 1, 2, 3. The temperature was falling. She could feel it against the skin of her face, the exposed strip between her hat brim and her collar. Not pain yet, but the cold was working toward pain in the purposeful way Dakota cold worked. 10, 11. The rope at her waist had some length to it. She did not know exactly how much. She had not measured it when she hung it on the peg. 15, 16, 17. She stopped. She turned her face into the wind and listened. Wind. The sound of wind is many sounds layered over each other, and inside a Dakota blizzard, those sounds are so loud and so varied that finding a small sound inside them requires a specific kind of listening, a listening that filters out the large and attends to the small. She listened. At 20 yards, she had heard nothing. She took 3 more steps. The rope pulled taut at her waist, her full reach from the shanty door. And then, not a cry, not a call, something smaller, the particular small sound of an infant breathing in a way that is effortful, that requires effort, that will not be able to continue requiring effort indefinitely. Left. 2 feet. She moved left. Her boot found something that was not snow. Lotta was in a shallow depression in the ground, wrapped in the blankets that had come loose from Hilda's grip. The blankets had kept her from the worst of the wind, and the baby had not moved, had not rolled, had curled into the instinctive stillness of very small children, in cold, that ancient mammalian response to preserve heat, by not moving, by becoming as small as possible, by waiting for the warmth that the body cannot produce on its own. Her lips were the color they should not be. Marta picked her up. She pressed the infant against her chest, inside her coat, against the warmth of her own body. She turned back toward the shanty. The rope was there. She followed it. Hand over hand, step by step, the wind pressing against her, and the snow blinding, and the cold biting through every layer she wore. She followed the rope back through the white, nothing toward the door she could not see, and the warmth she had spent 6 weeks building. The shanty appeared as a shape in the white, dark and solid against the nothingness. The door opened, Greta's face white and wide-eyed in the gap. Marta came through the door. She was still holding Lotta against her chest. She held her with one arm and closed the door behind her with the other, and stood in the warmth of the stove-heated room and breathed. Hilda was against the far wall, standing, which was the first time she had stood without support in 3 months, her face a shape that Marta had no word for. Greta took Lotta and unwrapped her with the quick, practical efficiency of a 9-year-old who has learned that in emergencies you do the useful thing. She carried the infant to the stove and sat cross-legged on the warm floor, and held her there, the two of them together in the heat that the clay was giving off, steadily, reliably, without any fire currently burning, just the stored heat of 6 weeks of work releasing itself into the room where they needed it most. The color came back into Lotta's face slowly. Marta stood by the door and watched it happen and did not speak. The stove radiated its patient heat. Outside, the blizzard became what it was going to become. The first night was long. The temperature outside dropped to 22 below zero by midnight, and the wind held at 50 miles an hour for the better part of 18 hours, and the snow drifted against the north and west walls of the shanty until the walls were insulated from the outside by 6 feet of packed white, which was, though she had not planned it, additional thermal mass working in her favor. Inside, the temperature held. She fired at 6 in the evening. 40 pounds of grass, the full load the firebox packed, and the dampers set, and the match struck, and the familiar roar of fast-burning fuel moving up through the channels and into the clay. 20 minutes of fire, then silence, then heat spreading outward through the whitewashed walls. Inside, temperature at 651 degrees. Inside, temperature at 954. Inside, temperature at midnight when she fired again, 48, having dropped 6 degrees over 3 hours. She loaded the firebox and fired and went back to bed. Inside, temperature at 3 in the morning, 52. Inside, temperature at 4 when she fired the third time, 49. She did this with a methodical calm that she recognized in some part of herself that was still observing, as the calm not of a woman who is not afraid, but of a woman who has decided that fear is not one of the tools available to her for this particular task. Rupert's fever came in the night. She had expected it. He had breathed the cold air running to the shanty, and his lungs, already compromised, had reacted to the insult. His temperature by 8 in the evening was 102. By midnight, it was 103. She put him on the floor near the stove. Not the floor at the base of the firebox, which would be too hot. The floor 6 feet away, where the heat from the clay radiated gently, and the temperature of the floor itself was warm enough to feel through wool stockings. She layered blankets over him and boiled snow for water, and made him drink small amounts every time he woke, which was often his body trying to process the fever and the warmth and the effort of breathing. She did not sleep. She did not sleep because Rupert needed watching, and because the stove needed firing at midnight and at 4, and because Lotta woke twice with the hunger of a baby who has been cold and is now warm and wants to be fed, and Hilda, who had used the last of her standing strength to cross the room when Marta brought Lotte inside, was back in bed and past exhausted. She sat on the floor between the stove and her grandson and her granddaughter and the sleeping infant, and she fired the stove when it needed firing, and she watched Rupert's chest rise and fall, and she did the one thing that was available to her in the hours when no task was immediately required. She waited. The second day of the blizzard brought Nate Halverson to her door. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of something moving through snow. A sound different from the wind carrying an intention in a direction that the wind did not have. She went to the door and opened it against the push of the drift that had built up against it overnight and looked out into the white. He came out of it like something the blizzard had decided to give back. He was on foot. His horse had not been able to move in the drift conditions since the previous afternoon, and he had walked 3/4 of a mile through the blizzard by following his fence line, and then the road cut, and then the frozen creek bank until he found the shape of her shanty in the white. His coat was covered in snow. His face was raw. His wife Dorothea was behind him, her right hand held against her chest in a way that told Marta something had happened to it. He came through the door and stopped. She watched his face as he felt the warmth. She had seen this before. She had seen it in Halverson himself when he came in December, and she had seen it in her mother's neighbors in the Molochna colony, and she had seen it in the faces of the rescue party that morning, 5 weeks from now, that she did not yet know was coming. It was always the same, a moment of adjustment, of recalibration of the face trying to reconcile what the body was feeling with what the mind had been expecting. He said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Dorothea came in behind him and closed the door. Her face was the face of a woman who has been very cold for a very long time and is only now beginning to believe she might become warm again. Halverson looked at the stove. He said, "We burned 3 chairs in the kitchen table." He said it the way you say a thing that you are still not entirely certain you survived. He said the stove went cold 12 hours in. The wood I had stockpiled was under 6 feet of drift, and I couldn't reach it. I tried. He paused. I have 12 cords of wood on that property, and I couldn't reach any of it. Marta said nothing. He said, "What's the temperature in here?" She looked at the thermometer. She said 52. He walked to the stove. He took his glove off and put his hand on the clay surface and stood there with his eyes closed for a moment. The heat moved into his hand, into his palm, into the cold that had settled in his fingers over the past 30 hours, and something in the line of his shoulders changed. Not completely, not all at once, but the specific tension of a man who has been fighting cold and losing began very slightly to ease. He said Dorothea's fingers. 3 of them. Frostbite. Marta brought Dorothea to the stove. She took the hand carefully. She did not unwrap the cloth Halverson had bound around the affected fingers in the early hours of the night, because unwrapping frostbite was not something you did quickly or carelessly. She set Dorothea's hand near the stove, but not against it, and let the ambient heat do what ambient heat could do, which was not enough, but was something, and something was what they had. Halverson sat on the floor with his back against the warm clay of the stove. He said, "After a while, I've been on this prairie for 10 years. I thought I knew winter." He was quiet. He said, "I burned my grandmother's rocking chair." He said it to the floor. Marta looked at him. She thought about the rocking chair. She thought about what it cost to burn the thing you brought from where you came from, the thing that meant a person you loved, the thing you carried to the new country, because it was the thing that couldn't be left behind. She thought about a feather bed traded for an iron door and damper. She said nothing. Outside, the blizzard continued its work. It had no deadline. It had no agenda beyond the cold and the wind and the white that went on for as far as there was prairie to cover, which was farther than any of them could walk. Inside, the stove held. Rupert's fever broke at 4 in the morning of the 3rd day. She felt his forehead when she woke to fire the stove and found it cool and sat beside him on the warm floor for a moment with her hand against his cheek and breathed. The wind was diminishing. She could hear it in the quality of the silence between gusts. Longer silences. Gusts that arrived with less conviction. A blizzard that was spinning itself down toward its ending. She built the morning fire. 40 pounds of grass. 20 minutes of roaring heat. Then silence and warmth and the steady, patient radiation of clay that had been doing this work for 6 weeks and knew exactly how to do it. She went to the small, greased paper window and looked out. The sky to the east was lightning, not the white lightning of a blizzard day when the snow diffuses the dawn into a sourceless gray. This was the actual lightning of an actual morning, the specific orange-pink of a sun that is about to appear above a horizon that is becoming visible again. The blizzard was over. She stood at the window for a while and let that be true. Behind her, Greta and Rupert were still sleeping on the warm floor near the stove, wrapped in blankets. They're breathing the even deep breathing of children who have been through something difficult and are sleeping now because their bodies have finally decided they are safe. Lotta was in her cradle. Hilda was in her bed. Halverson and Dorothea were on the floor with their backs against the stove. Halverson asleep, Dorothea awake, watching Marta at the window with an expression that still contained a great deal of the fear that had brought her through the blizzard and had not yet finished resolving itself into something else. Inside a temperature 51 degrees, outside temperature 20 below, and the sun was coming. Marta looked at the thermometer for a moment. Then she got out her composition book and wrote down the readings for the morning of January 14th, 1888. She was almost out of pages. The sun came up on January 14th like an apology. It rose over the flat eastern horizon of Turner County in a sky that had gone from blizzard white to the particular clear blue that follows extreme cold. The blue that means the air has been scoured clean of everything except cold and light, and it threw long orange shadows across the drifts that had reshaped the landscape overnight into something that no longer resembled the prairie Marta had come to in September. The drifts were 6 feet at the north wall, 8 feet where the wind had found the corner and built a wedge. The shanty itself was barely visible from any distance, just a dark shape in a white world, a low hump that might have been anything or nothing. But the door opened outward, and she had packed rags along the bottom threshold, and when she pushed it open on the morning of the 14th, the drift on the outside fell inward in a cold block, and the clean January air came in with it, and for the first time in 3 days, the inside of the shanty and the outside of the world were in contact. She stood in the doorway. The temperature outside was 19 below zero. The wind was gone. The sky was absolutely clear. Inside, the thermometer read 50 degrees. She stood in the doorway for a long time, feeling the cold on her face and the warmth at her back, the warmth that was coming from the clay, that was coming from 6 weeks of work that had required everything she had and had held. Halverson came to stand beside her. He said nothing for a while. He was looking at the white expanse of the prairie, at the drifts that had buried his fence line and the road and everything that had been at ground level 48 hours ago. He was looking at the distance toward his own homestead 3/4 of a mile northwest, where the shape of his roof was visible above the drifts as a dark line against the white sky. He said, "I need to get back, see what's left." Marta said, "Your pipes." He looked at her. She said, "Iron pipes. When a house drops below freezing for that long." He absorbed this. He said, "Yes, I know." He looked at Dorothea, who was wrapping her bandaged hand inside her coat with the careful movements of a woman managing pain she is not going to mention. He looked at the distance. He looked at the stove, which was still radiating heat from the overnight firing, still doing its work without any fire currently burning inside it. He said, "Mrs. Brenner." She waited. He said, "I'll be back." She understood this the same way she had understood it from Halverson in September, as something specific, a statement with a meaning that would be clarified by what came after it. She said, "I'll be here." Rupert was sitting up when she came back inside. He was pale and thinner than he had been a week ago, the way children get thin during a fever, and his eyes had the slightly unfocused quality of someone who has been very sick and is still carrying the weight of it, but he was sitting up and he was looking at the stove with the specific, clear attention of a 6-year-old who has arrived at a conclusion. He said, "Bye, Grandma." He said the stove never went out. Marta sat beside him on the warm floor. She said no. He said even when there was no fire. She said the fire puts heat into the clay. The clay gives it back slowly, for a long time. He put his hand on the floor beside him, feeling the warmth that had been radiating up through the earth from the base of the stove since November. He said, "How did you know it would work?" She thought about this, about the honest answer, which was complicated, and the simple answer, which was true. She said, "My mother built one. I helped. I was 16. It worked then, and I remembered how." Rupert was quiet for a moment. He said, "What if you had remembered wrong?" She looked at him. She said, "I would have built it again." He thought about this with the thorough seriousness that 6-year-olds apply to things that matter. Then he said, "I want to learn how to build one." She said, "When you are stronger, I will show you." The rescue party arrived at noon on January 15th. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of shovels working through the drift that had built against the door overnight, the muffled voices of men doing difficult outdoor work in extreme cold. She heard them the way she had heard Halverson coming through the blizzard by the intention. In the sound, the directed quality of effort moving towards a specific point. She put the bread in the oven. She had made the dough the previous evening and let it rise overnight near the stove, and she had been waiting for a reason to bake it, and the sound of shovels seemed like reason enough. By the time the drift gave way and the door pushed open, the bread had been in the oven for 20 minutes, and the shanty smelled the way rooms smell when someone in them is not merely surviving, but living. Erickson was the first one through. She recognized him as the kind of man who goes first, who takes the position at the front, not from bravery exactly, but from the habit of responsibility, the understanding that if there is something difficult to encounter, it is better encountered by the person who can manage it than by someone who cannot. He was perhaps 50 years old, weathered in the specific way that Dakota weather works on faces over decades, and he was missing 2 fingers on his right hand from frostbite 5 years back, and he had been on horseback since before dawn, checking the homesteads along the James River Valley. He had found bodies that morning. She could see it in the way he came through the door. The particular quality of exhaustion that comes not just from cold and effort, but from finding things you expected not to find and not finding things you expected from the dissonance of a morning that has already delivered several versions of the worst. He stopped just inside the doorway. She watched his face change. The warmth hit him the way warmth always hits a person who has been cold for a long time. As a physical fact first, something the body registers before the mind has processed it. His face changed with the warmth. Some of the held quality went out of it. And then he looked at the room, at the children who were alive and functioning, at Hilda, sitting up in bed with her color returned, and a bowl in her lap at the stove in the center of the room radiating its steady heat. He knelt. He pressed his palm against the floor near the base of the stove. He held it there. He stood up and looked at Marta. He said, "How?" She took the bread from the oven. She set it on the table. She crossed the room to the stove and placed her palm flat against the clay surface, the gesture she would make again and again in the months that followed every time someone new came through the door and needed to understand what they were looking at. She said, "My mother taught me." The other men came in behind Erickson, 4 of them cold and tired, and they stood in the small shanty and felt the warmth that the clay was giving and looked at each other and did not speak for a moment. One of them, a younger man, said, "What is this thing?" Marta said, "A stove. Russian design. My people built them in Ukraine for 200 years. He looked at it. He said, "It's not burning." She said, "No. I fired it at 4 this morning. It will hold until this evening." He put his hand against it. He said, "How hot is it in here?" She looked at the thermometer. She said, 51. He did the arithmetic that everyone did when they heard this number, calculating the gap between 51 inside and 19 below outside, arriving at the 70-degree differential that was the stove's testament and its argument and its complete vindication. He said, "I don't understand." She said, "The clay holds the heat. Iron does not. Iron takes heat and gives it immediately. Clay takes heat slowly and gives it slowly. You fire once, twice a day. The clay holds what the fire gives and releases it over many hours." The young man looked at the stove for a longer moment. He said, "Who else knows how to build one of these?" She said, "Not many. Here." He said they should. Halverson came back 3 days after the blizzard ended. He came on horseback this time, the horse picking its way carefully through the drifts that were compacting slowly in the clear January cold. He tied the horse and came to the door and knocked, which he had not done on his previous visits, and when she opened it, he was standing with his hat in his hands. He said, "Can I come in?" She said yes. He came in and stood near the stove, and she waited. Halverson was not a man who came to things indirectly, but this was clearly a thing he was coming to from the side, approaching it at an angle, and she gave him the time to find his way. He said, "The inside of my house got to 28 degrees. In the 2.5 days, the stove was cold." He said, "Margaret, her fingers. 3 of them. Doctor in Huron says she'll keep them, but she'll feel the cold in them for the rest of her life." He said, "We burned the kitchen table, the 3 kitchen chairs, the rocking chair that was my grandmother's. We burned up the floor in 2 places. Just the boards, prying them up with a poker and feeding them to a stove that wasn't working right anyway." He was quiet. Then he said, "And you burned grass. You burned 40 pounds of prairie grass twice a day, and your house stayed at 50 degrees, and your grandchildren are alive and healthy, and my wife is going to feel the cold in 3 fingers until she dies." She said nothing. He said, "I want to learn how to build one." He said it the way a man says a thing when he has been carrying it for days and is finally setting it down. She said, "I know." He looked at her. She said, "Come back in the spring. Bring paper. I will draw you the design." Inspector Dawson arrived in February. The roads had become passable again by the second week of the month, which in Turner County meant possible rather than comfortable, and he came on a horse that was picking its way carefully through the compacted ruts and made it clear by his posture that the journey had taken longer than he preferred. He tied up at the post and knocked, and she let him in. He did what he had done in October, which was move through the shanty with the efficient cataloging gaze of a man conducting an official assessment. He looked at the tar paper walls and the dirt floor and the rusted cook stove that she had pushed permanently into the corner since November. He looked at Hilda, who was on her feet now, actually on her feet, doing something at the small table, moving with the careful deliberateness of a woman building back towards strength after a long time in bed. He looked at the 3 children. Greta was doing sums on a piece of paper at the table. Rupert was sitting near the stove in the posture of a boy recently recovered from illness, who is not yet entirely well but is well enough to be restless about it. Lotta was in her cradle awake, making the sounds infants make when they are warm and fed and interested in the world. He looked at the stove. He walked around it the way Halverson had walked around it, the way the rescue party had looked at it, the way everyone who saw it for the first time looked at it, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with the categories they had available. He opened his notebook. He looked at the thermometer on the wall. He read the number. He looked at the stove again. He wrote something in his notebook. He wrote for a while, longer than she expected given how briefly he had looked at everything. Then he closed the notebook. He looked at her. He said, "Claim approved." 2 words. The same 2 words she had been working towards since September. The words that meant the 160 acres of Dakota prairie, and the shanty on it, and the stove in the center of the shanty were legally hers, that the Homestead Act had been satisfied, that no one would come in the spring and tell her the improvements were inadequate and the survival doubtful. He did not say anything else. He did not mention what he had written in October. He did not mention what he had said on his way out the door, the thing about knowing he was right if she and the children were not there in spring. He was a man who had made a judgment and been wrong about it, and he was handling this the way certain kinds of men handle being wrong, which was to state the correction and move past it without looking directly at the error. She did not require anything more than that. She said, "Thank you." He put on his hat and walked out. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride back toward the road. Greta came to stand up beside her. She said, "What did he say?" Marta said he said, "We stay." Greta leaned against her grandmother's arm and looked out at the white prairie and the retreating figure of the inspector on his horse and the sky above it all, which was the cold, clear blue of a Dakota February without a cloud in it. She said, "I knew we would." Marta put her arm around the girl's shoulders. She said, "Yes, so did I." Dorothea Halverson came first. She arrived on a morning in late February with her bandaged hand tucked against her chest and her eyes carrying the specific, direct quality of a woman who has made up her mind and does not intend to unmake it. She tied her horse and came to the door and said without preamble, without any of the social introduction, that most visits began with, "Teach me how to build it," from the beginning. Marta brought her inside. She pulled 2 chairs to the table and sat across from her and took out the piece of paper she had been drawing on since January, the diagram she had been refining for weeks, adding dimensions and notes in the margins, trying to put into 2 dimensions on paper what she had carried in 3 dimensions in her memory since 1840. She laid it on the table. She said, "The firebox first. Everything else follows from the firebox." She explained the proportions. The depth and width that determined how much fuel you could load, the height that controlled the draft, the lining of the firebox itself, the harder fired bricks that could withstand the concentrated heat of the burning zone without cracking or spalling. She explained the channels. This was the part that most people found difficult to understand, the part that separated the Russian stove from every other heating design she knew of. The channels were the intelligence of the system. They were the reason a fire that burned for 20 minutes could heat a room for 20 hours. The hot gas from the firebox did not rise directly to the chimney. It rose into the first horizontal channel and traveled the length of the stove and turned and traveled back and rose into the second channel and traveled again back and forth, a snake path through the body of the stove until by the time the gas reached the chimney pipe, it had given up most of its heat to the clay that had surrounded it. The clay held that heat. The clay released it slowly. This was the whole of it, the entire principle expressed in fired brick and mortar, in the geometry of the path the smoke took through the structure. Dorothea listened with the focused attention of a woman taking seriously what she had not taken seriously before, which is a particular quality of attention charged with something beyond ordinary interest. She said, "How long does it take to build?" Marta said, "3 weeks if you have help. 4 or 5 alone." Dorothea said, "I'll have help. Nate will do whatever I tell him." Marta allowed a small sound that was not quite a laugh. She said, "Good." The word spread the way words spread in places where people live at distance from each other, slowly and completely traveling through the mechanisms of church and store and the informal network of people who passed each other on the roads and stopped to talk, because stopping to talk was how you knew whether everyone was still alive. The story of the Brenner homestead and the blizzard in the stove traveled along these networks through February and into March, and it arrived at each destination carrying the essential facts intact because the facts were stark enough to survive retelling a widow with 3 children and no wood, a clay stove, a 3-day blizzard at 40 below, a house that held 50 degrees, and a rescue party that found warm air and bread baking. People came, not all at once. They came the way Dakota people came to things they needed to understand individually, on horseback or on foot, tying their horses at the post Marta had driven into the ground, and coming to the door with the expressions of people who have heard something that seems unlikely and have decided to see it for themselves. She let them all in. She showed them the stove. She put their hands against the clay. She answered the questions, which were always variations of the same questions. How did you build it? How long does the heat last? What do you burn on? What does it keep? The answers were always the same: clay from the creek manure, from the barn straw, from the prairie. 2 to 3 weeks to build. 40 pounds of grass per firing. 2 firings a day in the worst cold. Heat lasting through the night without additional fuel. Cost for the iron door and damper, $8. For the clay and the manure and the straw, nothing, or the cost of the labor to gather them, which was the only cost that had ever been free on the Dakota prairie. Greta helped. By March, the girl could explain the principle of thermal mass in both German and the English she had learned at school, and she could walk visitors through the construction of the firebox and the routing of the channels with the calm authority of someone for whom this information had been physical before it was verbal. She had helped build it. She knew it in her hands. Rupert knew it differently, as a memory of warmth, as the thing that had kept him alive through the fever and the blizzard nights, as the heat he had felt through the wool of his stockings when he lay on the floor and got better. Baby Lot was too young to know anything about it, except that the room was warm and the floor near the center was the warmest part of the floor. Spring came to Turner County in late March, which on the Dakota prairie meant that the temperature rose above freezing for more days than it dropped below it, and the snow that had been locked in place since November began the slow process of becoming mud. Halverson broke ground on his stove in April. He had bought the iron door and damper in Huron and hauled the materials from the creek bank, and he had brought 2 men from the Mennonite community in Freeman who had built Russian stoves before and who were willing to help in exchange for the labor exchange that was the primary currency of the prairie. Marta came over on the 3rd day of construction and walked through the rising structure and put her hands on the courses of brick and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "The second channel is too narrow. It will restrict the draft." Halverson looked at the channel. He looked at the drawing she had given him. He said, "How can you tell by looking at it?" She said, "I can feel it. The air moves differently through a narrow passage than a wide one." She pressed her hand against the inside of the channel. "You will lose 10% of your heat, maybe more, on every firing." He looked at it. He said, "How do I fix it?" She showed him. He tore out the offending course and relayed it. It took another day. He did not complain about the extra day. He had burned his grandmother's rocking chair in January, and he understood the cost of not getting it right. By May, there were 4 Russian stoves in Turner County that had not been there in September. By the end of the summer, 7 more were under construction. The Mennonite community in Freeman had organized 2 building workshops open to anyone willing to come and work, where Heinrich Schrag and two other experienced builders taught the construction from foundation to chimney pipe over the course of a long summer weekend. Dorothea Halverson had become, without anyone deciding this should happen, the person who handled the questions that came to the Halverson homestead from people who had heard about the stoves and wanted to know more before committing to the work. She answered them with the authority of someone who had sat across a table from Marta Brenner and learned the principle from the beginning and had then watched her husband build one and understood the construction from the inside. She sent several of the more serious inquirers to Marta directly, but she handled the initial questions herself, and the questions she handled were the ones about whether it actually worked in weather like this, and whether the clay actually held, and whether it was worth the 3 weeks of labor to build. Her answer to all three of these questions was the same. She said, "I lost the feeling in 3 fingers." She said Nate burned his grandmother's rocking chair. She said Marta Brenner fired her stove twice a day and never once burned a stick of wood. And when the rescue party came through after the blizzard of '88, they found her grandchildren playing on the floor and bread baking in the oven. That was usually enough. Inspector Dawson's report filed with the General Land Office in February described the Brenner homestead as a functioning claim with adequate improvements, including a novel heating structure of clay construction, demonstrating effective thermal retention in extreme cold conditions. He did not editorialize. He did not characterize what he had said in October or what he had found in February. He wrote the facts of what he had observed and filed the report and let the report say what it said. The report was seen by very few people, but the Brenner claim was approved and the land was Marta's, and that was the thing the report needed to accomplish. The note he had scratched in his October file, the one about survival being doubtful, was not addressed. Some things are not addressed. They sit in the record and become part of the history of what people said before they knew what they were saying. Erickson came back in April. He came alone on a Saturday with no official purpose. He tied his horse and knocked, and she let him in, and he stood in the doorway of the shanty and looked at the stove for a long moment. He said, "I've been thinking about this since January." She waited. He said, "The families I found that morning, 3 of them before I reached you. The Norwegian woman. She had gone outside for fuel and the blizzard came up while she was 10 yards from her door. She was found still holding the fuel she had gone to get." He was quiet. He said, "If she had had what you have, if the stove had not required her to go outside." Marta said yes. He said, "How many people in this county are going to go through another winter with iron stoves and not enough wood?" She said many. He said, "What would it take to change that?" She looked at him for a moment. At the man who had knelt on her floor in January with 2 frostbitten fingers and pressed his palm against warm clay and said, "How?" She said, "Teaching. One household at a time. It takes 3 weeks to build, and it takes someone who knows how to build it being willing to show someone who doesn't." He said, "I'll help with that." She said, "I know you will." The summer of 1888 was the warmest Marta had experienced since leaving Ukraine. She worked. She always worked. The homestead demanded it, and she had not yet arrived at an age where she believed the demands of the land were optional. She broke a small garden in the soil east of the shanty, planting the seeds she had ordered from a catalog in Freeman, learning what grew in Dakota soil and what did not, and making notes in the composition book that had served the winter. Greta helped with the garden and with the younger children and with the visitors who came through in the warm months. More of them now people who had heard about the stove, from people who had heard about it, from people who had been there, the chain of telling that spreads knowledge across a sparse population. Rupert recovered completely by June. His cough disappeared in the warmth of the summer, and Marta watched it go with the specific, quiet satisfaction of someone who has been worrying about a thing for months and is watching it resolve. Lottie learned to walk in July in the shanty, her first steps taken on the earthen floor that had been warm all winter from the stove above it, and that was cool now. In the summer heat, the clay releasing the last of its stored winter warmth as the season progressed. On an evening in late August, Marta sat on the step outside the shanty door and looked out at the prairie. The grass was tall in every direction, the blue stem and the buffalo grass and the blue stem that came back every year, regardless of what the winter had done, tall and golden in the late light, moving in the small evening wind that came across the flat country from the northwest. The sky above it was the particular deep blue of a clear summer evening on the plains, the blue that goes down a long way that has nothing in it between you and the stars that would come later. She put her hand against the wall of the shanty beside the door. The clay was warm from the afternoon sun, not the stored warmth of winter firing, just the ordinary warmth of a summer wall that has been in the sun all day. She could feel the difference. She had been feeling both long enough to know what each felt like the deep, patient heat of clay that has been fired and stored its warmth in its mass in the surface warmth of clay that has simply been heated from outside. In November, she would begin firing again. The first fire of the new season, 40 pounds of grass, 20 minutes. The roar of hot gas moving through the channels, the heat beginning its slow migration into the clay. The clay beginning to remember what it had given out the previous winter and preparing to give it again. Greta came and sat beside her on the step. The girl was 9 years old and had been 9 years old for 6 months and would be 9 years old for 6 more months. And in that 9 years, she had crossed an ocean and lost her father and arrived in a place that was not the place she came from and had learned to mix clay and form bricks and understand why fire moved through a channel the way it did. She said, "Are you thinking about next winter?" Marta said a little, "Not yet." Greta leaned against her grandmother's arm the way she had leaned in the doorway in February after Dawson left and looked out at the same prairie. She said, "Will it be as cold?" Marta said, "Probably." She said, "Will the stove hold?" Marta said, "Yes." Greta was quiet for a moment. She said, "How do you know?" Marta put her hand against the warm clay wall and held it there. She said, "Because my mother built one, and her mother before her, and the one my mother built is still standing. The design is older than anyone living can say. It has been through every cold that the places it was built in could produce for longer than Dakota Territory has been a territory. The clay does not forget." She paused. She said, "And I built this one right." Greta considered this. She said, "I want to build one someday. My own. From the beginning." Marta looked at her granddaughter. She said, "I'll show you how." She said, "You already know most of it." The light faded slowly over the prairie, the long Dakota twilight that stretched the day out longer than you expected, and the grass moved in the evening wind, and the stove sat in the center of the shanty behind them, cooling now in the summer heat, patient waiting for November, ready to begin again. The knowledge that had come from a woman in Ukraine to her daughter, and from that daughter to Marta, and from Marta to Greta, was not in any book. It was not in any agricultural bulletin or university report or government record, except for the brief, factual notation in an inspector's file about a clay stove of novel design. It was in the hands that had mixed clay and manure and straw in proportions that worked, in the hands that had formed 800 bricks and laid them course by course around a firebox and a set of channels that knew how to take heat from fire and keep it until it was needed. In the hands that had pressed against the warm clay on a January morning while the rescue party stood in the doorway and could not find words for what they were feeling. Marta Brenner had carried this knowledge across an ocean in her memory and down a road in a wagon and into a $31 homestead at the edge of what was livable and had built it into the earth of Turner County, South Dakota, where it had held through the worst blizzard in 40 years and kept 4 children alive through 3 days at 40 below zero. She had not invented anything. She had remembered something. Sometimes that is the more difficult thing. The stars came out one by one in the deep blue above the prairie. The grass went quiet as the evening wind dropped. Inside the shanty, her grandchildren were settling towards sleep, and the stove stood in the center of the room in the summer dark, waiting as clay waits with the patience of material that has outlasted every winter it has ever encountered and expects to outlast this one too. It would. She knew it would. She went inside and closed the door.